good evening and welcome again. I say again because this is our second podcast for the Bluff Creek Project Podcast. So we're pretty excited. The first one was a great episode. Got to talk to Chief Robert Leiterman. Well, he's not a chief anymore. He's retired. And Rowdy Kelly, which was awesome. Had a really good conversation. A little in-depth conversation about the Bluff Creek Project and kind of where it's come, where it's going, where it's been. And so here we are. Again, my name is Kipp Morrill. I am one of your hosts, and I'm joined again by the amazing, talented, handsome, and young Tate Hieronymus. Tate, how's it going, buddy?
It's going good.
Awesome. And I'm assuming that you're still in Iowa. You haven't moved from there?
Not yet. We've had some crazy weather
Not
today.
yet.
It was like a thunderstorm, then it turned into hail, then we were getting snow. It doesn't make sense anymore.
That is crazy. Wow. Well, I can't say that we've had any kind of crazy weather here in Sacramento, but I can say we've got a crazy guest on here tonight,
sure.
And I'm pretty excited about this. But you know, we've kind of stuck to the whole theme of trying to get to know people who are deeply involved and heavily involved in the Bluff Creek Project. And we've got, once again, one of the original members who is going to give us some tremendous insight. His name is Jamie Wayne. Jamie is actually a scientist. He comes from, he's actually working as a geologist, but he's also an extremely talented scientist in other things, molecular biology. He's also, he is actually, in all seriousness, he is extremely capable of basically fixing anything, turning anything into something else, and has shown, the project been extremely valuable. His time spent over in Humboldt County, he spent a lot of time putting cameras together and really is, I would say, probably the backbone of the project. So without further ado, Jamie, welcome. Thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, you guys.
And so I guess the first thing is, you lived over in Humboldt County for quite a while. Jamie and his wife lived over there. They're not currently living in Humboldt County, but how did you get involved in this whole crazy world of Bigfoot? Because it seems like, going to Humboldt State, being a scientist, it just seemed like it's maybe a little bit out there to get involved with. But how did you get involved?
Well, I guess, it's kind of a long story, I guess. My first involvement, I've always kind of been into Bigfoot and UFOs and stuff like that. But the very first thing was I bought a map of all of the back roads of Humboldt County. It was like a 6 rivers map. And I remember reading about Bluff Creek and how the Patterson film was filmed up there. And as soon as I got the map, I put an X where the Patterson site was supposed to be. And I can't remember what original spot it was. It's still on my map. I still have the map. But it was just something that I had in my house. And I remember telling my wife about it, that I wanted to go look for the site and things like that. And she said that she had talked to one of the park rangers up there who she was working with at the time, and he was involved in Bigfoot and looking for Bigfoot and would do Bigfoot expeditions. And I thought that was pretty interesting. So I told her to put a call in and see if I could tag along one of his expeditions. And that was, of course, Robert Leiterman. And we did a couple of hikes over a weekend, and I was pretty much hooked after that. So that was pretty much the start and how I got into it. And then from there, I met Steven Strufert, and I visited him and was just wanted to pick his brain a little bit, as pretty much everybody does who wants to go into a shop. And I mentioned that I had worked with Robert Leiterman. I had gone on some hikes and things, and I said that I'd like to help out, and they really needed some help with some of their map geometry. They had gone down to the film site a few times, and they were trying to locate the original film site. So at the time, I was working on my math requirements for my degree. So I'd actually been taking a cartography class and doing a trigonometry class. So I offered to, see what I could do. And
a cartography, the study of carts.
Yeah. Yep.
Wow.
Yep. No, it was
Well,
it was just a mapping class, like a geography class. But it was kind of I had already finished 3 years of college at that point, and I was just kind of going back to school because I was working as a mechanic originally, and had worked on school and decided to go back to school at Humboldt, and that's when I met Steve. I was kind of in my final years there. Yeah, that's pretty much that, I guess.
Awesome. Well, cool. Well, I guess the most interesting part of being a scientist is you tend to look at things, I guess, a little more critically. And so, I think that people that have that kind of background have that whole Occam's razor thing going on where, looking for whatever is the most logical answer for something. But
yeah,
but having said all of that,
you really have to.
Do you believe in?
Well,
do you believe in Bigfoot, Jamie?
Well, obviously the obvious answer is that belief requires some sort of a suspension of like logic. You can believe that something is a similar word I like to use is idea. I like to say that, I have an idea of how they could exist and things like that. I've had encounters with what you would call Bigfoot before, or encounters with animals that exhibit Bigfoot-like behavior. So I am inclined to think that they are real, but I definitely hold it open that I was that I've been mistaken or I could be mistaken about it. So I don't like to say that I believe because there's always a chance that they're not. But I definitely have a lot of ideas about them, and maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. But when you're a scientist, or when you more importantly, when you practice science, you have to kind of follow the evidence for things. And right now, there is a scientific consensus on Bigfoot, and that's that it doesn't really exist. That it's just people are seeing bears walking around, or the tracks are really faked, or they're bear tracks. But for me, I don't really have a problem with Bigfoot existing. It's not like, they're not, the Bigfoots are not like a supernatural being. They're, if they're around, they're going to be either like a feral person, like a feral human, or they're going to be like a great ape, some sort of an animal, like a gorilla or orangutan. But I've got a lot of ideas about it, but nothing's really, I don't have any beliefs. I don't say that, they're for sure one thing or the other, I guess. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
I don't know if that was.
No, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't know if I was rambling.
I definitely get it. No, I get that, and I guess that would just kind of lead into, obviously, we're talking about the Bluff Creek Project, but the film, the iconic 1967 film where Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin filmed what they suspect and what a lot of people believe is an actual Sasquatch or a Bigfoot. And with that, with your scientific background, etc., having been a member of the Bluff Creek Project from the beginning, what's your thoughts on the film?
Well, the film itself is a piece of evidence, and you kind of the way it was filmed and the guys that filmed it, particularly Roger, you kind of have to suspend all of the issues with them and just kind of judge the film on itself. Roger had a lot of issues. He was filming a documentary at the time, and he was basically he spent like over a year just driving around and filming random things for his film. He even had people dress up in a Bigfoot suit and walk around. This was up in Yakima, and so anybody that knows that side of the story is going to say, oh, well, he was making a Bigfoot movie and he was just filming a Bigfoot scene up there, and they use that as evidence. But the reason he went up to Bluff Creek in Humboldt County is because that's where tracks had been found. That's the location of the Jerry Crew tracks. That's the location of the Peter Byrne trackway, which was famously that was one of the Ray Wallace hoaxes that was done up there. But it was known as the Bigfoot spot, where the term Bigfoot was coined. That's where people went to look for these animals, look for these creatures. So, it would stand that if you film one up there, that's where they were because people had seen them. So it's totally plausible to me that if you back then, when people were seeing them, if somebody had a camera, that they would, and they saw one, they would get it on film. So it doesn't really matter Roger's original intentions. The film has the feeling of being filmed rapidly. It's not it's fleeting. It's just kind of, it's bad. It's not like a perfect shot, and it's not too close yet it's not too far where you can't really see what's going on. So I think that's kind of the allure of the film, because it's actually fairly clear what you can see, versus there's so many films that they have to, or so many hoaxes where they film from so far away, you just see like a blurry blob and they say, oh, well, maybe that's it. But, if they were to film too close, you'd see a zipper on the back of the suit or whatever. So I think that's the beauty of it, is that it's actually filmed close up enough to where you can see it. And when you look at the enhancements on that people have done on the film, I mean, it looks like an animal. It looks like, you can't really see a zipper. You can't really see anything that indicates it's a fake. So for me, I think that's very compelling. There are some issues as far as the timeline, things like that, but I can I can attest that I've been to the site now probably between 50 and 70 times probably in the last 10 years, and I can't remember what we did 5 years ago down there on a particular day. Like, I have no idea what I did a couple of years ago or whatever, and if I tried to recall it, I would probably get my facts all mixed up. So any of the timeline issues that were addressed years after the fact, I think that's just because the memory is not the memory of those details isn't really there. So I kind of excuse all that. But when you look at it, I mean, it looks like a Bigfoot. So,
well, it's interesting because it depends on what camp you're in, because there are those on the side that say it's definitely a fake. You've had the Bob Hieronymus part that's come out, but it depends on what side you're on it. Those that really want to believe a lot of people, whether you're on the side of, I don't believe, or the side that you believe, many people became interested in this subject. I would say that there's probably two things that have gotten people involved and interested. Number one, the 1967 Patterson-Gimlin film, and the other two, the second one would have been the Legend of Boggy Creek. And it seems like those two iconic moments within, I guess you could call it, Bigfooting history, have seemed to kind of get the most people interested.
Like before that it would be the Jerry Crew trackway, right? Then would be Boggy Creek.
That was the Bigfoot. People believed in Bigfoot before Patterson, and that was because they used to find tracks all over the place down on Bluff Creek. And I've actually had personal where I've talked to Jay Rowland, where he has talked about it. And Jay was there with Jerry Crew. And Jay is he's not a Bigfooter. He doesn't like Bigfoot enthusiasts. He doesn't even like talking about Bigfoot sightings, but he loves talking about Jerry Crew and them building the Bluff Creek Road. So when I talked to him, I remember asking him about, not really what he thought or does he believe in Bigfoot or anything like that. I was asking him details about what happened. And he explained about those drums being thrown in the creek. That was up at the Notice Creek Bridge. And he was saying there's no way that anybody could do that. And they would come back and find their equipment messed up, and they would find these tracks around. And this is kind of before the Wallace brothers started doing their stompers and their hoaxing and that type of thing. So the original first stories, they basically were viewed as being true. And a lot of people say that, oh, well, maybe they were just messing with Jerry at the time. Maybe he was, I work on construction crews, and I work with on oil rigs and stuff. And I know how all those guys kind of mess with each other, but Jay Rowland was really adamant that no one faked that those were genuine things by something that came into camp, walked around, and threw those drums in the creek. And Jerry Crew was he was the guy who poured the plaster cast, the first one, and he got his picture taken in the paper. And the story goes is that he really wanted people to know how serious he was about it, so he tried to frown in the photo. I can't remember who took the photo. I think it was Betty. Anyway, the name escapes me. The reporter for the Times Standard. No, I think at the time it was called the Humboldt Times. But he has this straight-faced look, and he really wanted to convey that this was a real thing. He was utterly convinced that these animals were real, and there was something walking around down there. And when they first, I don't know if you've seen the original article from '58, but they actually had like this giant cartoon caveman caricature that they had a picture of right next to Jerry Crew. So they had Jerry Crew holding up the track, and he looks super serious. Then they had this kind of goofy caveman. And so I think he was kind of upset at that. He wanted people to understand that there was something, really incredible going on out there in the Klamath Mountains. And, I think there was some issues after that. I think he didn't want to talk about it too much anymore. He didn't want to be like a poster child for Bigfoot. He just wanted to, do his work. And he really thought that it was important enough to go to the newspaper with this, So it's really interesting how it got started. But, where Roger and Bob filmed Patty was just up the creek from where those tracks were originally found. In that area, the Karuk and the Yurok and the Hoopa, they all have Bigfoot stories. and they talk about Bigfoot not like it's a spirit, or they have all these weird spirit animals and these ghosts and things and demons. But when they talk about Bigfoot, they talk about it like it's a tribe. So when you look at the original oral traditions, like from the Krober book, from the Yurok Narratives book, and the Lucy Thompson book, they talk about these things coming into camp like they were just a regular part of life, and they used to chase them out. They had major problems with them. They would come in and steal their fish, and they would have to chase them out. And it was part of their life that these things existed down there. So for me, I can totally understand how maybe there were some of these things up there in the hills, and maybe they're still there. Who knows? But the area is so huge. When you go up there, it's, you stand on top of the mountains and you can see for, 60, 70 miles, no problem. And, on clear days, you could see Shasta, you could see all the way up to Mount Ashland, and then you could see the fog from the ocean to the west. And, you can even see like the glow of lights from Redding. And it's just, there's nothing in between. And the only places that there's really roads that people drive on are, they're down in the canyons along the Trinity and the Salmon and the Klamath River. So people don't really drive up into the mountains. And there's very few areas that actually have roads that actually go up to the tops of the ridges. And all those ridges are flat over there. It's kind of interesting geology, but it's, there's not many places where the roads actually go up to the ridges. And that's kind of where you see a lot of these, that's where a lot of these Bigfoot stories come from. They come from these ridge tops, crossing the road and things like that. So it's definitely a very interesting area. And I definitely think that there could have been Bigfoots out there, or there could still be. So,
well, and it's interesting too, as we talk about a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch being, a physical being, an animal or a feral human, I think it goes without saying that animals will always try and utilize the path of least resistance if they can. So obviously having those sightings on roads, having those sightings on ridge tops, like you spoke about, that seems like a fairly logical thing for an animal to want to do.
They're not going to walk sideways on the hills. They're going to walk either straight up or straight down. I mean, Kipp, you're familiar with wilderness travel, and you're not, when you're walking around those mountains, you're either going to walk along the creeks and the valleys, or you're going to walk right on the ridge tops. And in the Klamaths, the ridge tops are flat. If you go and stand on any of the hills, you look out, they're all the tops of the peaks are the same height. And you look out and they're big, flat ridges. And that's because it actually used to be underwater, and it was all wave cut by the ocean. So, these are big, giant, flat ridges that used to be flat ocean floor. It's like a highway system through there. It's really fascinating. The best description of the Klamath Mountains comes from the book The Klamath Knot by David Wallace. David Wallace. Yeah. And he talks about how it's one of the oldest ecosystems that we have, especially on the west coast of the United States. I mean, the Klamath Mountains have existed kind of in their same configuration for 10 to 20 million years. So you're going to have a lot of this topography is just very, very old. It hasn't changed much. It's not like the Sierra Nevadas where you go up to the mountains and it's all been carved by glaciers, which is geologically, it's fairly recent. And all the forests are these, homogeneous forests where you have giant fields of sugar pine and yellow pine and all these pines. But you go into the Klamaths, and all of the trees have co-evolved to live together. It's got some of the highest plant and tree diversity of anywhere, especially on the West Coast. It's really kind of amazing because it was so close to the ocean that it escaped glaciation. So in the Sierras have been covered by glaciers. So the glaciers kill all of the trees. So when the glaciers recede, the trees come back, but the only trees to come back are the pine trees and some of the firs. But you don't get, the sequoias that come back. And even today, the only places you find the sequoias are where there were, where they escaped glaciation during the last ice age. So it's really kind of this relic environment that has really remained unchanged for millions of years. So it's really just a fascinating area, I guess. But as far as the animal travel thing goes, it's very easy for them to travel on the ridge tops, and they would travel kind of in a like a north-south direction along the ridge tops, and they would travel the creeks. So it stands to reason that the best place you're going to find Bigfoot is going to be in those creeks or up on the ridges. And, that's what we find. That's where everyone sees them. They don't really see them on the roads that are halfway up the mountain.
It's interesting you say how, like, the travel of least resistance, because like in 64, the flood that cleared out that area in Bluff Creek, it was really wide open. And that makes a lot more sense that a Bigfoot was down there, possibly when Roger and Bob ran across one.
Yeah. And the flood was only a couple of years before. And, the flood was from logging. That was one of the main causes, was because they actually were dumping debris in the creek bed, and they had, they when they would take their bulldozers down there, they would actually just drive them straight up the creek. And they did not care about building culverts, or they did not care about the debris they were putting in. And when they would log, they would cut the trees right there, and they would cut all the branches and just leave everything there. So when it flooded, everything went into the creek. So you had these giant log jams of just 100 feet thick, a quarter mile long of solid logs and water. And what happened was it all went down, and it jammed up in a couple of different spots, but it actually formed a big dam. And when that dam broke, that's when you see the major flooding back there. So that's what really carved Bluff Creek. And as anybody is familiar with Bluff, the mouth of Bluff Creek where it dumps into the Klamath, that's actually where one of the log jams were. It blew over the top of that ridge right there and cut that gigantic canyon below the bridge. Because Bluff Creek actually used to run through that campground, the Aikens Creek campground, which is right before the bridge. So the highway, the highway wasn't really there. It was kind of like a smaller road, but it blew everything out, that big log jam. So when it did that, it just scoured everything and left this nice, fine, silty sand just covering the creek. It was like a highway. So, I mean, it's back then you could just walk right up the creek like it was nothing. And they used to drive, they would drive all the way up the creek. There were several logging roads that were back there that were cut by, there's these reclamation logging crews that came there after the 64 flood, and they just drove bulldozers up those sandbars and just cut little roads. So that's what Roger and Bob, they went up there and they rode their horses along the dirt road. So it was not like they hiked in there and it was like, this super crazy spot. And where they had camped with their truck, the site was only like a mile and a half up the road from where they had camped. So, so it stands to reason that, they get from their camp to the site fairly quickly. That explains a lot of the timeline issues. For us now, it's like, it's like an expedition to visit the site. You gotta, take the Jeep road down, and, you gotta bring chainsaws and cut your way through. And, But back then it was like a highway all the way to the site.
Yeah, it's not so easy.
It's been interesting to go into.
Sorry.
It's been interesting to go into some of those places where those old road beds are all overgrown and have been for a while. And I know that there was a road at one point at Notice Creek that would come up out of the canyon, and I believe people used to drive down that to Louse Camp back in the day, and that's completely overgrown now. So I don't know if it's impossible. Have we, the royal we, tried to locate the actual campsite where maybe Bob and Roger had camped?
Well,
have we tried that?
Robert did. Robert is pretty sure he knows where it is. And I think he found a piece of rebar or something out there. But from what he says is that it should be there. It's basically from the Bluff Creek Bridge. You just go upstream on the east side of the stream, on the right side of the stream if you're looking upstream. And, it's not that far up above the bridge. So it's like a half mile or something. And there's just this big round gravel bar. And it stands to reason that would have been probably where it was. I mean, who knows where it exactly was, because it looks totally different. And we don't have any photos of it. They weren't taking pictures in camp at Bluff Creek. So we don't really know exactly where that was, but, we have a description of it, that was just one of the places that people camped. And I think there actually was an X on the map there. I had noted it in one of the maps that I made, but there was a hunting camp over there. So if you look at some of the older maps of Bluff Creek pre-64 flood, it names a bunch of hunting camps, and they were basically like Native American hunting camps where these guys would go up. Each family would maintain a small hunting camp, and they would, that was one of the areas that they would go hunting. And back then you could just hike up the creek. It was like a 10-mile backpack trip up the creek, and people used to go up there and go hunting. Even at the Bluff Creek film site, there's an X on the map, and it's called Ferris Camp. So it's actually pretty interesting. But at the Roger and Bob campsite, it's got another X on there, I believe. I could be mistaken about this, but it's pretty interesting. Yeah.
So would Louse Camp be one of those family names, do you think? Or I know Beans Camp would be.
Yeah,
but I never
Louse Camp
never
is as well, and there was some sort of a settlement there. But basically, there was Indian trails and minor trails that went along Bluff Creek originally, and they all got washed away during the flood. But there's still places that you can find the old Indian trails. One of them is the Blue Creek Trail. There's a trail that goes all the way from Elk Valley all the way down to the mouth of Blue Creek, and it's actually in the Sierra Club guide for I think it's called Bigfoot Hikes, where it talks about hikes up in the Klamath Mountains, and that was one of the original hunting trails, and it was just the Yurok used to use that as one of their main hunting routes. So they would just, they maintained every year they would do hunting groups that would go up from the mouths of these creeks all the way up to the headwaters, all the way up to the top of the Klamath Mountains. And it was the same for Bluff Creek. There was a trail that ran the whole way of Bluff Creek all the way up to the headwaters. And that was just a family hunting grounds for people. So it was, that area had been traversed for thousands of years before all the Bigfoot stuff and before all the logging. Sadly, most of that history is lost. There is some maps that indicate that there were native sites up there, like Fish Lake is one of them. And there's a couple other spots, and the names escape me, but in the Kroger book it shows Bluff Creek, and it shows a few names and what they mean briefly, but we don't really have much information on the stuff up there. But anybody that goes up there knows that it's kind of like a sacred area. It's definitely, it feels weird up there. It feels I don't get the feeling that I'm unwelcome up there. I just get the feeling that it's just like an ancient place,
it's almost like
that
visiting
it's
the pyramids.
You've got the Yurok, the Karuk, and the Hoopa have all three. I believe their creation story is up in that. Is it Medicine Rock up there?
Up at Dr. Rock. Yeah,
Dr. Rock. Yes.
Yeah. So that was kind of that was their. I don't. When you talk about this stuff, it's hard to get everything right, because I've read it in a book, and whoever wrote that book probably is picking information out of some other book, and it's easy to get stuff wrong. But a lot of the creation stories come from that area up in the high Klamath Mountains. One of them is Dr. Rock. There's a bunch of most of the peaks and those really interesting looking rock formations, they actually all have names, and sacred rituals and things that are done up in those areas. And a lot of them are still done today. They still do pilgrimages up there. Different families have different rituals. Kroeber writes about when they do the dances, they send they have several dances. They have the Yurok and the Hoopa. They have the white deerskin dance and the brush dance, and there's a few other ones. But part of those ceremonies and things involved them selecting new doctors, which were basically women. They were medicine women or young women who went through a rite of passage, and they had to. One thing they would do is they would not let them drink water, and they would end up making this pilgrimage without drinking water all the way up to the high country, up to the peaks, into these sacred areas, and they would basically be hallucinating. And they would go up there and they would have visions, and it was supposed to be like it was basically a big rite of passage thing for them to journey all the way up to the sacred areas. So they kind of all have that in common, as far as their medicine person rituals. And we're really fortunate to have all this information from most of it comes from Kroeber, who was a Berkeley anthropologist at the time. He's real famous for Ishi. He's the one who just who wrote the book on Ishi, and Ishi the Indian that they found out of Chico. And most of this information would have been lost, because most of these tribes were completely massacred during the gold rush, and there wasn't hardly. They were just a shadow of what they used to be. I've seen figures. 95% of them were either killed off, and the young women were basically married off. So most of the tribe that we have today were these, the descendants of these young women who were basically married off to gold miners. And so you don't really have a lot of the traditions didn't really survive. And what we have is descriptions of them in the book. Kroeber interviewed all these elders and things, and they tried to pass on some of this information, but there's definitely been this big revival in the culture there, where they try and rediscover all these things. So a lot of these accounts of these pilgrimages that people would do, they're different. They're they have different descriptions of what they were for. It's kind of hard to understand, and no one really talks about them today. I don't think they really do many of them today. I know they do some stuff up. I don't want to reveal place names, but there's some places up there where they still do rituals and dances, and there's private dances that they do, in these areas, and private ceremonies. I've been up there a few times where they've put out, they put out signage that says, "Do not talk to anyone you see." They don't want you to talk to any of the young people, because they do these rite of passage rituals and things up there, and part of their ritual is not talking to people, or not is not getting any help from people. So they go up there and they try and fast and have these visions and things. So I'm not sure what it looks like today, but I imagine it's kind of like a fun camping trip or something like that, or along with
well, I know from my experience being with incident management teams with wildland fire, that when we are up in that area, there's certain places that we're asked not to overfly with our aircraft, and some of those. So it's still taken very serious. And I think it goes without saying, you were mentioning that you get kind of an interesting feeling. But I think the one thing I really always have appreciated with the people that we tend to hang out with and we go up into those areas with, is that everybody's very respectful about the land and about how we leave things. I appreciate that we pick up our garbage, we pick up other people's garbage. And I think it's one of those important things to remember, is that we are guests in those areas. Not, we're guests in on that land, on that landscape. So, hey, Jamie, I wanted to ask you real quick. You mentioned earlier that you'd had some experiences that you had a hard time explaining. You didn't want to say that they were for sure a Bigfoot, but you didn't know. Would you mind talking a little bit about some of those, or at least one of them, about what it is that you may have encountered or seen?
Yeah, that's interesting you brought that up. Yeah, I did recently. I told you about one of my encounters that I hadn't really told anybody. I'm not really, I don't know if I want to talk too much about that. I can a little bit, but my first encounter with a Bigfoot-like creature was down off the coastal trail where we go hiking, out of Oric, where I used to live. And I came back from the ocean, and I had been hiking all day, and I heard people talking out in the distance, and I knew there was no one there, because when I had come in, there was no one else was parked there at the parking lot, and it was really interesting. But it was like just a distant talking that I could hear, and I remember yelling out, like, to see if anybody would reply. I didn't get any reply. They were very it was very short, and I got some basically tree knocks back. There was this knocking sound that came back. It was just like you see on TV with Bobo, knocking against trees. And from then on, I was like terrified, because I still had about a mile and a half to hike back to the car, and it was dark at that point, and I just had my little headlamp, and now I'm miles back in the canyon, and there's things talking and banging on trees as I'm hiking through. And that was just one of those things where it was like, in my head I had to be like, okay, was it pot growers that were out there? And then I knew, the canyon's too dark to grow pot out there. Like, you're not going to be growing pot out there. And there's no, there's a couple places you can kind of maybe set up a tent and go squat or something like that. But where I was at, there was no flat ground, and it was a big, it was a big swamp. It was like a muddy flat. There was, 12 to 18 inches of water, standing water on the ground, and the trail goes above the water on raised gravel. So, I knew that no one was really back there. So it was just one of those things that was very, it was very scary to me. And I basically was terrified. And I ended up hiking out with this story. Like, I encountered this thing that was talking and banging against trees. So that was kind of one of my holy crap, maybe they are real moments. And that was really early. That was really early in my, Bigfoot investigations, I guess. So it was, it was a profound experience, I guess. And I've had a couple other encounters with, Bigfoot-like things. I used to see bears all the time. When I'd go up Bald Hills Road, I'd see 3-4 bears every time I went up there. It was rare to not see bears run across the road. So I was so used to seeing bears. And the only time that I ever saw, I had basically 2 encounters up there. And one of them was a bear. And it serves as a pretty interesting reminder to me to where I could be mistaken, where I came around on one of the windy sections and I saw a giant furry thing standing up that was about, it looked about 7 feet tall. It was as big as, it was bigger than the front of my car, and it was standing straight up. And its back was to me, and its head was kind of turned, and it almost looked like the back of a football player or something like that. And I couldn't really see its legs too well. And, as I came around the bend, I lost sight of it because the way the road was shaped, it was like an S curve. So I caught a glimpse of it around one curve. And then as I came around again, there was a 400-pound black bear that was cinnamon tan colored, and he was running down the road. So for me, I had about 10 to 15 seconds of, oh my God, there's a freaking Bigfoot right in front of me. And that was that was really eye-opening for me, because I know at that point, if I didn't see it continue run down the road, that would have been the best Class A Bigfoot sighting. It would have been in, David Paulides' book, and he would have paid me, $200 for my story, like he was paying everybody back then. And, I could have bought a lot of beer with that money, to be in the Hoopa Project book. But it was just kind of one of those eye-opening things. And the other time I saw something was actually when we were going to we were filming the Willow Creek movie with Bobcat, and I was coming up there late. I had just put an engine in my Subaru. It was kind of interesting because I pulled the engine out of my Subaru, and I had just I had done the head gasket on it, and my engine was out. And I had borrowed my wife's truck to go to the Bigfoot film premiere, the Willow Creek premiere down in Arcata. And they were all saying they're going out to Bluff Creek. And I said, oh, well, that'll be great. I'll go out there too. But then I remembered that my, I didn't remember, but my engine was out of my car. So I went and I spent all morning putting my engine in my Subaru, and it took me, I had a bunch of problems, and basically it went from, a torn apart engine on my, in my garage, to me putting this engine back together, putting it, and it's maiden voyage after I just, put the whole thing back together, in the dark. Its maiden voyage was driving up the Bluff Creek. So I didn't get in till 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night. It might have even been later than that. I can't remember. But I just remember, going up Icy Road, the Go Road, and I was up at that flat section up around mile marker 14 or 15, and there was something on the left-hand side of the road, and I noticed it, and it was like just this big dark thing. I couldn't really see it, and I was ripping fast on my Subaru. My Subaru just kind of like, it kills it on those roads, and I drove right towards it, and the thing went right across the road, and it was standing up like it was just like my previous one, like it was the bear. But it was tall, it was big, it was on two legs, and it had gone across the road. And by the time I got up to it, I could basically see the thing, and had stepped off the road, but it was standing by this tree. And as I went up to it, it just kind of skittered down the embankment there. And I remember I stopped and I jumped out of the car with my flashlight, and I pointed the flashlight down. I could hear it ripping down. Like, anybody who's been up there, like when a bear crosses the road and you stop and you jump out of your car with the camera to film the cool bear, often all you can hear is this just like ripping through the woods, and that's exactly what it was. It was just all I could hear was just ripping through the woods down below. And, I must have scared the hell out of it or whatever. But that was one of those things where I was like, what the hell did I just see? Like, what just happened? Like, did I just see one? And at the time I was trying to, I was basically, playing the part of the rational scientist, and so when I got into camp, I didn't really tell anybody. I didn't say that I saw, a giant Bigfoot. But I did go into camp, and I, told them I saw this weird bear that kind of ran across the road, and it was just kind of always been something that's in the back of my mind. But, I have been up there, 50 times, 60 times at least. I mean, at least 10, 15 times a summer we would go up there hiking around, and I've seen hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bears and mountain lions and all these animals. And this thing was, it was big, it was tall. It could have been a bear standing straight up. Maybe he was like, standing straight up, clawing a tree, and then just like ran across the road while he was still standing up. So I still, it's just kind of one of those, like, I don't know. I don't know what I saw, I guess. But that was the other time. And I try not to, I don't want to, like, put those out there as that those are my like Bigfoot encounters, but those are my things that are interesting that I've had happen to me up there. And of course we've had dozens of times where we've made weird calls and gotten anomalous stuff back, or just weird stuff. Like recently with Robert, we had the thing make flute noises back to us when Robert was playing his. I don't know if he talked about that in the last one, but
I think he kind of did a little bit.
Yeah, we had a really. I don't want to reveal the camp that we were at. We weren't at Louse Camp, but we had camped in a special spot.
Yeah, I know exactly where it's at.
Yeah, I don't want to tell anybody. I don't want to, put that out there on the podcast. But heck, I remember Robert playing his flute at the campfire, and I was just standing there looking down on the creek, and you could see the moon was reflecting off the creek, so it almost looked like there was lights down there. It was kind of like little flashing, bouncing lights down in the bottom of the creek. So I was like, it's like tripping out. And I was like, wow, this is really cool. And Robert just stops playing his flute because he the reeds, he has to like let the reeds dry out if he plays for longer than like 10 minutes. So he stopped playing the flute, and like 10 seconds later, something whistles back like the same tune that Robert was playing. It's crazy. And I have a recording of it actually, and I never really I didn't think I picked it up because I had the microphone was down further down the road, but you can actually hear it play back. So I did not imagine it, and it sounds just like him playing his his goofy little flute. So for me, I was just, I was tripped out. That was like, like that is weird. That is something interesting. And it wasn't an owl. It wasn't like an owl sound, and we run into these barred owls that, they sound like monkeys fighting in the woods. And those are crazy if you haven't heard those. But, this was something different than that. This was not a barred owl. So
it's hard to explain what that could be.
Yeah.
I mean, it's when you have these situations where people have rocks thrown at them, you think, well, what can throw a rock? And there's not many things without having that opposing thumb that will pick up something and throw it.
Actually,
so, but like
that reminds
describe.
me of another story. Actually, I haven't told you guys this, but I was actually in a bar down in Taft, in the Bigfoot hotspot mecca of Taft, California. And one of my buddies owns the bar down there, and he went and he tracked me down there, and he's like, hey, I got to introduce you to my buddy. Like this is my friend. This guy that he introduced me to, he was one of the oil field workers there, and he was telling me how he used to have a mining claim up on the forks of the Salmon. And he's like, everyone at the table's there, and my buddy's like, oh yeah, this guy Jamie's really into Bigfoot. He does this Bigfoot thing. You guys really need to talk. Like, this other guy's got this really great Bigfoot story. And the guy goes, he's like, he's telling me, these things are real, man. He's like, that son of a bitch threw these rocks down on top of me while I was camped out, and it was a giant thing up on top of the ridge. And he was really passionate about it. I mean, he was almost like in tears over this thing, because there was a bunch of people at the table, and they had all been drinking, and they were basically making fun of him for his Bigfoot story. And this is a professional guy that worked for an oil company at the top, like not a low position at the oil company. And this guy's telling me about how years back he had this mining claim. Well, I guess I can retell the story, but he said that he came into camp before everyone else, and he was working in camp, and something starts, these rocks just start rolling into camp from up on the hill over the campground. And he was terrified. He said he couldn't figure out what's going on. And he went over there to look and thought maybe, it was like a landslide or something. And he said that there was a giant hairy person on top of the ridge hurling the biggest rocks that they can down the mountain. And it was crashing into the campground. And he said it was like, I mean, we've all been up on the side of hillsides and rolled big rocks down, and how fun is that? But he said this thing was screaming at the top of its lungs, like screaming bloody murder and rolling giant boulders down the hill on him. And he said it did it for over an hour straight. It was not like one boulder. He said he was terrified sitting in his truck as these boulders were rolling down the hill. And he said that his buddies came into camp and he told them about it. And they're like, and they almost didn't believe him. And he said that night he got in his car and drove away. And he didn't come back for like 2 months from their camp. And but they had a mining claim out there. And he said he spent a whole summer out there on this mining claim, and that was the last time he went out there. Was basically attacked.
It wasn't
him.
near.
And so he described it as basically an hour-long attack on him from the ridge. And it's really cool. I have his contact info too. He's a super cool dude, but and he's not really into Bigfoot. He's not a Bigfoot person, and this is just him out there working. And this is up at the Marble Mountains, right at the forks of the Salmon, which is right there, not too far from Bluff Creek. So, I mean, just fascinating story.
It reminds me of the 8th Canyon incident thing.
Yeah, and that's what it reminded me of too. Was just this thing just hurling missiles at at this guy's camp to get him out. And, there's tons of these stories, these things, just doing that. There's one of those in the Kroger book where they would roll boulders down the hill at people.
Well, it's funny.
And,
do you know if it's happened at Louse Camp yet? I mean, because Louse Camp it's like in a canyon type area in that bowl.
Yeah.
And there's that huge ridge at the backside of it.
Yeah. There's actually a road up there. So I don't know if you knew about that or know about that, but there's a road on the top of that ridge.
I think you told me that before and I just forgot.
Yeah. You can hike part of that road. I've done part of that. It's the same road system that takes you to Deer Lick.
Okay.
Deer Lick Lake.
Yeah.
And I think that's where Kipp did his famous hi ho video where he's chopping the log.
Yeah,
I don't know if you guys have seen that, but it's
that
really
is a classic.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of
classic.
Plays some of my different talents, which I get that. So
yeah,
I just saw it recently. It's pretty funny.
Well, it's interesting. In my profession, I'm working wildland fire, and I usually bridge the subject with people, and I'll say, well, I got this hobby, and people will say, oh, really? What hobby is that? And I'll say, well, I say that I'm an avid Bigfoot Sasquatch enthusiast. And I usually get one of two responses. One is, oh my God, are you serious? That's the first response. The second response is typically will be, oh, I totally believe it. And I was with a firefighting friend of mine who was actually one of my trainees as an incident commander on a fire. And we went to drive a part of the fire. And I said, I got this hobby. And he says, really? And I said, yeah. And I told him. And he looks at me and he goes, oh, I totally believe that. And I said, really? And I said, why is that? He said, well, and this particular individual used to be the superintendent of a hotshot crew. And he told me he had a young firefighter that had worked for him that came from the Hoopa Nation. And this particular firefighter told him a story that he had gone fishing with his grandfather somewhere on the Trinity River, and that they had just started fishing. And then all of a sudden, giant rocks started raining down into the water. Not just rocks, but boulders. And this young man distinctly remembers his grandfather looking at him and saying, the hairy man doesn't want us to be here. We need to go. And packed up their fishing gear, and they left. But, it was interesting that it was a story like that came from a young Native American firefighter to the superintendent that kind of helped the superintendent believe in what was going on. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But the comment about the hairy man doesn't want us to be here.
Oh yeah, it's like you ask a lot of these guys and who live out there, and they all have a story, and it's not like when you ask them their story, it's not like, oh yeah, my dentist knew a guy he met at a gas station who had a sister. It's like, I went up there camping and the thing threw boulders at me from the top of a hill, or I was up on the road and the thing ran across the road, or my grandma used to go and bring them food in a basket every third Saturday of the month, and then they wouldn't, then they would bring them good luck or something, So everyone has a story up there, and there's a lot of folks that don't have stories, but it's totally possible to live up there and not be an outdoor enthusiast, to not go on the trails and not, I remember being up there in Oric, in the most beautiful area in the world, right by the national park. And I met somebody who had lived in town her entire life and had never been to the park to see the redwoods, which were a mile away. And they're like, oh, well, we drive through there all the time, but I've never actually walked around, And I'm like, you've never hiked any of the trails? And they're like, what, like tourists? You know, it's like, oh, like, so it's totally possible to, to live in these areas and not be a believer or not be, so not everybody is, not everybody that lives up there is like, has these sacred stories of their, grandmother or something like that. Everyone up over there's got, they all have iPhones and they drive cars and they go to college and they, are, aspiring musicians, or something. They're normal, they're not like this, like primitive people up there that some people think. Like if you read a David Paulides book, he makes it seem like you drive onto the reservation and everybody has a secret. Like everybody has a secret that they're not going to tell you, and they're all in on it. And they all, so these are just people that live up there,
Yeah.
They're not, and for the most part, they're all super cool and fun to hang out with. And I go fishing with them. I got a lot of friends that are Hoopa that live on the reservation. I actually took a calculus class at their reservation headquarters in Hoopa. So, I mean, I was driving there 3 days a week and hanging out, and they're all just regular people that live there. It's not like this, but when you live there and you hang out in that area, you're going to have encounters. Just like when I was there, I spent like 8 years there, and I had 2 or 3 pretty interesting encounters. So it's just that's just kind of the way it goes up there. It's just an interesting spot. Highly recommended. I don't know if you guys have been there, but definitely check it out.
Jamie, I do want to ask, what do you think is the next step for the Bluff Creek Project? We've got those cameras up there. We've actually gotten some incredible documentation of the different wildlife there, including the Humboldt martin and the ring-tailed cat, which is pretty interesting. But we've been at it for a while. We've gotten some really good information. But what do you think's the next step for the Bluff Creek Project? And certainly, it's seeming to be getting a little more challenging because you've moved away. You still have Robert and Rowdy and Steven, but Ian's moved away. Dustin, of course, lives up in Oregon. Tate's back in Iowa. I'm in Sacramento. But what do you think's the next step? What should we be trying to do? What's next on the agenda?
Well, we don't really have an end to the project. A lot of these kind of, whenever you do any type of scientific research, you really need to define like an end to your experiment. But I think of our project more as, as exploration versus pure research. So I think as far as right now, I'm just maintaining the camera project kind of at a manageable level. We have not as many cameras, and the cameras that we do have are usually localized into areas where we can service the cameras in one day. I remember at one point we had cameras, at Onion Lake, Twin Lakes, Mosquito Lake, 3 or 4 places on the ridge, 10 cameras at the Patterson site, and then 5 or 6 cameras up and down the creek. And it became, like 4 days to check every to check all the cameras. It would take days and days and days of hiking. And so now we've kind of consolidated everything, where we mostly have the film site cameras and then a couple other spots. But the cameras now don't really require hardly any maintenance. We don't have to change the batteries every 3 weeks. I think our first cameras that we had that I was using, they only lasted like 6 weeks on batteries, and I had them hooked up to, old car batteries and things, and they were all like custom made things to last the winter. But now they last. Some of the new cameras we have last more than a year. They last like 14, 16 months. So we have these systems you could just leave down there, and you could hike in there once a year and check them, and they're full of pictures, and they still got juice left in the batteries. So for me, I think we just maintain the camera project there. I do have some other areas that I want to check out. I've got kind of my mapping project that I've been working on now, and where I'm up here in Tahoe, there's a lot of like interesting sites that have Bigfoot history to them that are pretty interesting. One of them being this year, I plan on doing some more work out in the Rubicon Valley. Up there's a book that I have that details some encounters with gold miners up in this remote area up above Forest Hill, between Forest Hill and the Rubicon River. And then there's another area which was the favorite Bigfoot hunting area of Bigfoot legend. Oh gosh, what's his name? His name escapes me. The crazy guy who used to dress up as an alien.
Book Beckjord.
Yeah, Beckjord. Yeah. So Eric Beckjord had his favorite Bigfoot area, which he swore they were at. It's actually not too far from Hope Valley, where we go camping sometimes.
Oh,
so
wow.
I'm gonna go check that out next time I'm up there.
Is it now called the Jamie Wayne Project, the JWP?
JWP.
Well, it could be the Jamie and Kipp Project, the JK Project.
I like that.
Yeah, like we could go up there and put some trail cameras up there, and anyway, I just thought that'd be a cool spot. And then I do have another area of interest I'm working on, and that's this. I'm doing some research up in an area which is it's called a Sky Island, which are out in Nevada. There are these giant mountain ranges that extend north-south, and they're separated by these valleys, and up at the tops of these peaks are these really ancient forests that are relatively unexplored. They have really high biodiversity, and one of the areas recently been opened up by the Forest Service, and there's a nice little campground up there, and there's some local legends in the area, but I want to go up there and put some trail cameras there because I think there's going to be interesting species, interesting animals up there, because the area's been basically cut off for the last 12,000 years. It's been separated from all the other ranges, by these giant Pleistocene lakes that used to be out there. So I think that's another area I want to check out. I'll probably put some trail cameras up there as soon as it melts out, maybe in the next month or two. And maybe I'll convince you guys to come up and do a couple of tree knocks up there, and then some Bigfoot howls.
That sounds pretty.
We'll have a good time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sounds like a good time.
Well, Jamie, we've been at it for a little while here. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your Sunday and joining us here, and it's been extremely insightful, which I fully expected. But thank you so much, and we'll have to maybe try and invite you back when maybe we get some more information from those Sky Islands. That sounds like a pretty interesting type of an endeavor.
Yeah. So cool. Well, thanks for having me, you guys, and hopefully we'll get down to Bluff Creek soon. Probably in June, maybe July, once if we're not all dead from coronavirus.
Yeah. I plan on being there on the 10th of July.
And my hope is that I can.
All right.
But things are so. I do have to do this job thing, so I have to go out and get, which happens to get in the way of my big side biz. So.
Yeah, those dumb jobs. I'm unemployed now, so I can. I've got all the free time in the world, so I can do some squatching for the next few months.
Okay, Jamie, we're gonna be there for 2 weeks. Me, Terry, and Stevie. So.
Oh, okay, cool.
We're gonna camp at Bluff Creek for 2 weeks.
Awesome. That'll be fun.
Oh heck yeah!
Well, folks, we really appreciate you tuning in and listening.
Cool.
This again is our second podcast. The first one last week was with Rowdy and with Robert. This week we were with Jamie, and proved to be, again, some really good information. And so we hope you enjoy it. And that's all about I have. Tate, anything to add before we call it a night?
Thank you, Jamie, again for coming on. And until next week, we have been the Bluff Creek Project Podcast.
Good night.